Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my Midweek mystery series and another Jane Doe story. Today we're going to be talking about the Vernon County Jane Doe, who has remained unidentified since May 1984. But the wonderful people over at DNA Doe Project are on the case, and I figured we could help by sharing and talking about her story. As I always say, it just takes the one right person to recognise her face or a detail, and we could help get a case solved, a person identified. Big goals, but you never know. It was the 4th of May 1984 between 1:15pm and 11:30pm when three teenagers driving down a gravel road came across the body of a woman. This was Old Line Road, about 4 miles west of the town of Westby in Vernon County, Wisconsin. It was very clear that this woman was no longer alive, and the teens drove to a nearby farm to call the Vernon County Sheriff's Office to report what they'd found. A patrol deputy was soon dispatched to the farm where they met the teenagers before being led to the location of the body at around 11:50pm. Straight away, the deputy noted seeing vehicle tracks on the freshly gravelled road that clearly showed a car making a U-turn. This was later analysed to be a short wheelbase vehicle. Soon other officers arrived and the scene was photographed and processed with the assistance of the Wisconsin Crime Lab Bureau. It was believed from early on that this woman had been killed at another location quite nearby before her body was driven to the location where she would later be found, but there had been no effort made to conceal the body at all. The body was completely unrecognisable when it was first discovered, with extensive damage to her face as the result of blunt force trauma. Jane Doe had been bludgeoned beyond recognition, and it was later found at autopsy that she'd suffered a broken jaw, a broken eye socket, and her dentures had been smashed inside her mouth. She also had injuries to the left ear that were thought to be caused by a knife, but it was the blunt force trauma that was later found to be the cause of her death. And as if all of this wasn't horrific enough as it was, the woman's hands had also been cut off at the wrist, presumably in an effort to prevent her being identified via fingerprints, and the hands have never been found. We can assume that that's why her face was so severely damaged as well, but mortuary workers were eventually able to reconstruct her face. I don't usually like to include post-mortem photos in my videos, but I did used to like to include them in my Doe videos because obviously they're very helpful when it comes to identifications. However, I have recently found that when I do so, YouTube restrict the videos and not nearly as many people see it as normal, which obviously goes against what we're trying to do here, it goes against trying to spread the word. So instead today I'm just going to leave links down below to the post-mortem photos if you would like to go take a look. They're not graphic at all, there's no blood or obvious injuries, it just looks like someone who's sleeping, but obviously for identifications, it's very helpful to see her face. Jane Doe was a white female standing at 5'5" and around 150 pounds. She was middle-aged, between 50 and 65 years old at the time of her death, and it's thought that she had been dead around 24 hours before she was found, maybe as long as 48 hours. She had tinted brown hair with streaks of grey at the temples and may have had a perm shortly before her death. Her eyes were blue, and interestingly she had long untrimmed toenails that had a hooked appearance. She also had a vertical scar on her abdomen around 4.75 inches long just down her midline, and her blood type was O positive. In terms of clothing, Jane Doe was wearing a brown, tan, black and turquoise plaid 3/4 length coat lined with a pink and purple fabric, a blue and white dress with a large paisley print pattern on a black background, a light blue turtleneck top, nylons rolled just above the knees, and tan slip-on shoes in size 8.5. It's noted that both the dress and the coat appeared to be homemade, and obviously she had no identification on her. As I mentioned previously, Jane Doe did wear dentures. They had been smashed inside her mouth during the attack. They were full dentures and did have some numbers inscribed in them. On the tissue side of the upper denture, there was the number 420 inscribed with a burr tip instrument, and there was also 289 in raised lettering that had been put on the denture when it had been originally manufactured, it seemed. 2 of the teeth on the dentures were missing, and she did have generally poor dental hygiene. Moulds were made of her gums and x-rays were taken of her mouth in the hopes that would eventually help with identification once they found her dentist, something which of course has never happened. The evening after the body was discovered, television reports aired. A couple from nearby Westby called to report that they'd seen something unusual on Cutter Cross Road in a US Highway 14 between Westby and Coon Valley, not too far from where Jane Doe would later be found. They said they had seen a bright yellow compact car parked with a man outside of it, the man moving around to the driver's side from the passenger side at around 9:45 p.m. on May 4th, 1984. Just an hour and a half before Jane Doe would be found. When investigators went to check this area, they found a piece of the broken denture, some blood, and a man's Psycho wristwatch. The band had broken, separated from the watch at one end. There were more tyre marks here, but this time the tyre marks suggested that somebody had suddenly sped away at a great speed. So the officers theorised the suspect had pulled off of US Highway 14 to dump the victim at this spot, when the couple who would later report this interrupted him. The man quickly gets back in his car and speeds away, the tyres spinning as he did so. From there, he drove to Old Line Road and dumped the victim there instead. The couple weren't able to say the exact make and model of this car, but they did identify a bright yellow colour associated with a 1982 Datsun from a colour chart. Thousands of state vehicle records and manufacturer archives were examined, but nothing of interest was ever found. Time flew by, but the Vernon County Jane Doe remained unidentified despite 400 leads being followed in the following few months. To this day, it's believed that over 4,000 tips have come in. Jane Doe was eventually buried in the Viroqua Cemetery in Vernon County, her headstone simply reading, Jane Doe found murdered on May 4th, 1984. Over the years, a number of bulletins have been circulated through police and coroner circles, dental lab journals, and cold case groups across the country, and there's been nothing. At one point, there was an arrest of somebody who'd been fraudulently using checks from a missing woman from Amherst, Wisconsin, who disappeared around the same time Jane Doe was found murdered, but this didn't end up leading anywhere. Jane Doe was compared to every single reported missing female in her age group internationally, but still nothing. It doesn't seem like this woman was ever reported as missing. Investigators don't actually think she was from the area in which she was found. They know for certain that she wasn't from Vernon County, which was a relatively small place. They pushed for news of this story to reach further slung areas of both Wisconsin and Minnesota, but she really could have been from anywhere in the country. I mean, if the killer had gone to the effort of cutting off her hands and destroying her face in an effort to stop her from being identified, it makes sense that they probably wouldn't then dispose of her body in her home county or anywhere near it. And whilst we're on the subject, did the killer maybe suspect that Jane Doe's fingerprints would have been on file somewhere, hence why they felt the need to cut off her hands? Had Jane Doe been in trouble with law enforcement before? That could suggest that the killer knew her personally, knew her past. This was a brutal murder, and I really want to stress how horrific it is that her hands were cut off. It suggests that this was pre-planned, as I don't really know many people who go around with tools strong enough to cut through bone on their person. Whoever did this thought about it carefully. They brought a very sharp knife with them and were prepared to go to the effort. I saw a lot of speculation that this was a serial killer, but I don't think so. This MO is too unique. I think there's a possibility that this woman wronged whoever did this, or at least they perceived that she wronged them and this was their revenge. But that's just my own opinion. I do think this strikes me as a more personal murder. It's now been 37 years since Jane Doe was found, but the search for her identity has not died down. In fact, it's got more power behind it now than ever before. In 2012, all of the evidence from this case was re-examined, new technology used when relevant. The State Crime Lab took another look at the forensic evidence, including the woman's clothes and the dentures. But above everything, the Vernon County Sheriff's Department and the Wisconsin Department of Justice hope to spark new interest in this case via social media. The sheriff, John Spears, said, "With the media coverage today, with Facebook and Twitter and all the other things that are out there, somebody is going to look at the picture and say, that was my neighbour 30 years ago, or that lady frequented our store. She has a past, she has a history, it's just finding it." They embarked on this huge, ongoing social media campaign to get some answers. In 2015, Jane Doe's body was exhumed and sent to the crime lab in Madison, Wisconsin for new updated testing before being returned and buried the very next day. DNA was also harvested at this point and was sent to the University of North Texas for processing. It's that same DNA that the DNA Doe Project are working with today to get her name. The status of her case on their website is research in progress, so I do think we might still have a while until they reach an answer, but I have no doubt they will eventually, they always do. Back in 1984, when Jane Doe was found, there was no procedure for DNA testing, it just didn't exist, so utilising all of the newest technology is key here. That same year, in December 2015, an updated forensic facial reconstruction was released by the University of Arizona. It was created using physical characteristics of the woman's skull by forensic artist Georgiana Falsetti. Her husband is actually one of the people working on the case at the university. Although we do have post-mortem photos of Jane Doe and her facial characteristics are quite clear in them, it's still important to have drawings, reconstructions. Some people don't like to look at photos of dead bodies for obvious reasons, but also Jane Doe would have been dead for a number of days by the time her face was restored to that state. There would have been post-mortem swelling and dropping. People simply don't look the same in death as they do in life. In Georgiana's drawing, she looks like she's alive, and that's important. That's how Jane Doe would be remembered by people. In early 2018, all of Jane Doe's clothing was submitted to the US Customs and Border Protection in Chicago for pollen testing. I have spoken in videos before about the importance of pollen testing in does, what exactly it is, but I'll give you a quick rundown here as well. I actually think I might have spoken about it in my video on Woodlawn Jane Doe, who has actually recently been identified as Margaret Fetterolf. The pollen testing didn't have anything to do with the identification, but it was interesting. Pollen testing isn't something that's widely used in criminal investigations, as there is a lot of room for error here, but it does have the potential to provide some interesting information about does and their past journeys. Wherever you go, you're picking up pollen from the local area. You won't realise it, but tiny spores get stuck to your clothes, making you a map of your recent travels. You can probably work out why that's helpful in doe cases. It's very handy to figure out where they've been recently, where they spent a lot of time. In Vernon County Jane Doe's case, the pollen indicated that she'd spent time in New Mexico or Arizona before her death, which is literally the other side of the USA, with Wisconsin in the north and New Mexico and Arizona in the south. Could this be where she was from? Could this be why no one has ever come forward as recognising her? Although back in the 80s they did try and get word of the case out as far as they could, communication was a little bit more difficult back then. As I always like to say at the end of my doe videos, everyone has a name, an identity, a life before death. Everyone deserves to be buried with that most simple thing, and I'm on a mission to spread the word where I can. Vernon County Jane Doe was quite a lot older than a lot of the does you find who tend to be in their teens or early 20s. She was in her 50s or 60s, she'd lived a whole life, and you can get to know a lot of people in 60 years. I refuse to believe that nobody recognises her, but the worry is now that people her age back in the 80s would now be coming to the end of their natural lives. The sooner word can be spread about this, the better. Some people call this the perfect murder, but I don't believe that in the time of social media. There must be someone out there who knows her. Tips about the identity of our Jane Doe can be called in to the Vernon County Sheriff's Department, the details of which I'll leave down below, or they can also be emailed to vcso@vernoncounty.org. Thank you so much for watching this video. As I always say, if you live in any of the areas I've mentioned in today's video, then please share this. Talk to people who had been Jane Doe's age. You never know. And I guess I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.